Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a social sciences researcher with a lot of interest in how ideological and philosophical beliefs play out in people's actual lives. The videos I make on this YouTube page tend to be about more overtly political topics, but today I'd like to briefly articulate an idea I've been considering the implications of for a while now. I call it non-practicing veganism. Essentially, what non-practicing veganism boils down to is, as you might have intuited, a professed belief in the correctness of the vegan argument, but nevertheless still consuming animal products. Before I explain it, let me digress, and please bear with me here. The typical vegan worldview that you'll be familiar with asserts that there are a number of personal and ethical benefits to completely avoiding all animal products. That means no eating meat, cheese, milk, eggs, fish, honey, and not wearing stuff like leather and fur. I tend to agree completely with the ethical arguments themselves, which I'd like to run through in a moment in a greater detail. However, I believe you can acknowledge these sorts of arguments and agree with them even, and just not have it influence your actual behavior. Take, for example, the most simple of all the reasons one might go vegan. The first is just simply the ethics of killing animals for meat. There's a very simple argument attached, and it gets right to the point. For thousands of years, humanity's approach has largely been to kill what we want, when we want it, without necessarily weighing up the ethics of the act of killing itself, or even prescribing any need to be consistent about it. For example, the average Western consumer most likely eats meat, and every adult consciously knows that commercial meat comes from slaughterhouses. Even knowing this, most adults would still probably balk at the idea of personally killing a typical stock animal, like a cow or a lamb, while also probably not batting an eye at the idea of swatting a fly or stomping out a roach in their house. And surely the hardline vegans would point out the hypocrisy of that, and they would have a great point in a vacuum. It's a very good point that most people wouldn't want to kill livestock themselves, either because of the cultural associations that surround killing, especially the killing of larger and broadly more intelligent and more imminently anthropomorphizable animals. But people are perfectly happy to willingly consume animal products, knowing that doing so increases the demand of killing livestock elsewhere. Perhaps the choice to eat meat or wear fur or leather is just easier if the necessary killing is sufficiently abstracted away from the consumer. Or perhaps the average meat-eating person just intuits that actually you don't really need a perfect, holistic, logical framework for everything you do in life. Normal people know that you're just allowed to do things the simple way without overthinking something as unexceptional as eating or wearing clothes. Dare I say, it's also not the best use of your own time or effort to get needlessly worked up over how other people do either. And just because the value of, say, a cow's life compared to something like a bug's is technically a completely arbitrary quantity, it doesn't mean you have to be fine with the idea of either personally slaughtering things or concede there's absolutely no rules whatsoever about what can and can't be eaten. I don't think the more recent emergence of veganism itself has created this debate, however. We know that this same basic argument has been going on since at least classical ancient Greece, when plenty of people were into having this discussion, if only purely for the sake of the philosophical game. And we practically solved the issue 3,000 years ago, then and there. Although now, the modern vegans' investment in taking a side here and perpetuating their views is what's essentially keeping the argument going. Back then, the general consensus was that it's just much more defensible and reasonable and rational to kill and consume, for example, a sheep rather than a horse. The thinking there, perhaps lying in the purely pragmatic analysis that a horse has much more utility alive, and that sheep are easier than plenty of other animals to raise and breed and farm and consume. Nowadays, we don't need to base our reasoning on what to eat on the purely pragmatic anymore. We're long past the point as a species where commercial farming is done by township collectives in dire need of maximizing resources just to survive. If we really wanted to, humanity collectively does have the resources to mass farm and slaughter any sort of animal it wants. And we stick to a particular handful, like cattle, pigs, and sheep, in most of the West today, largely just out of tradition. The capitalist powers that be could and would start farming anything that lives on this earth en masse tomorrow if there were suddenly enough demand to make doing so profitable. Okay, eating meat isn't essential to humanity's survival anymore. And if someone ever brings this up in person, in order to skip the argument, I'll just agree with them completely. I'll even concede that a lot of the meat industry is run completely irrationally, and that the animals that we as a society consume have been chosen fairly arbitrarily. But that doesn't mean I'm going to change my behavior in any way, though. I'm still going to eat meat because I enjoy it and it's readily available. I don't think that the analysis and application of ethics should be all about trying to strip yourself of every pleasure in life just for the sake of being purely rational, whatever that might mean to you. With the assertion that for every single piece of meat I consume, I'm, in effect, unnecessarily condemning some poor animal to death for my own pleasure, then yes, I agree completely. But consider the following. I enjoy eating meat, so I'll keep doing it. It's my morality, and I can define it however I want. Even if you hold certain philosophical principles to be true, you're still allowed to act how you like. One's personal code of ethics isn't some immutable force of nature. Say, for example, you were an Orthodox Jew, and you believed, among other things, that the kosher dietary laws were unassailably correct and properly interpreted instructions from on high not to eat certain types of meat. And you were devout in every other respect, but you still enjoyed a pork chop every now and then, because you reckon God will understand. You can hold that belief, and you can still be Jewish. Same goes with Hindus and beef, or Muslims and drinking alcohol, or any other dietary prohibition. And that's basically the crux of this non-practicing veganism of mine. I'll acknowledge the ethical correctness of the typical vegan argument all day long, but I won't be changing my behavior. And I'm fine with it, and that's what matters. While we're on the topic, and while I've hopefully still got your attention, I think I might as well address a few related issues. There are some people, even more radical than most vegetarians and vegans, who extend the argument that all animal life is equal to explicitly include humans in that judgment too. That's to say, in their belief, that not only is a large sapient mammal like a pig and the lowliest fly each of an equal sacrosanct worth, any animal at all is as valuable as any human. If you've ever seen any of those pro-veganism documentaries like Dominion or Earthlings, you'll have heard the spiel before. Essentially, this line of thinking points out, yes, there is no all-knowing, independent, and unbiased source that can objectively say that one type of animal's life is better than any others, including a person's. But the argument goes further that everything else being equal, you can't give any purely rational reason why it is that, say, a cow's life is any more intrinsically valuable than even a person's. And from a certain angle, and in a vacuum, perhaps, this philosophy does seem to have a point again, much like the last argument. And it's true that a lot of the importance that human society at large projects onto animals is devoid of any sort of objective actual measure of worth, but you don't need a perfectly rational argument to explain why you think a person is worth more than a pig, and it's certainly not speciesist to think so. Now, the people who express this all animal lives are equal view are the real hardline veganism types, but no one actually believes that. No one, not even the loudest among the hardcore environmentalists, actually believes that any animal's life, no matter how small or fleeting, is equal to a human's. They're just pretty clearly trying to make a point about how wide a society arrives at norms without any sort of implicit objectivity. Credit where credit's due for sticking to your guns, perhaps, but it only makes a decent point, again, if you look at the argument in a total vacuum. It falls apart when you consider the actual implications for a second. None of the people making that argument really treat any two groups of living things' respective value as just a matter of numerical quantity. Show me, for example, any self-described animal rights activist who thinks in good faith that, say, two mice would be doubly as precious as one person. No one really thinks that, and if they did, they'd just be wrong. It's similar to when anti-abortion activists try and tell you that they think any fertilized egg is a sacred life. That's not true, and furthermore, they don't actually think that. They just want to undermine your right to terminate a pregnancy because they're a reactionary zealot. Think about it for a second. If they, or you, were in a position where you could only either save one newborn infant or 24 embryos, which would it be? There is, in fact, a correct answer here. Have a little common sense in either case. Not all life is equal, and no one really thinks that. And while I'm on the topic, when you do hear someone argue for a position that defies any good sense like that, don't just try to refute it. Save yourself the time entirely and normalize just saying, no, you don't actually think that, and no one does. Then walk away. Especially since a lot of people arguing for stuff out there in the world are doing so in bad faith. And don't ever fall into the trap of trying to change hearts and minds or save anyone's soul by talking to them. When it comes to veganism, teaching people to be conscious of the animal products they use and where it comes from is always going to be better than trying to reason yourself or others into why you supposedly shouldn't eat meat or drink milk or wear things made of leather and fur. If I see a fly in my office, I could try and do some quasi-deep rationalization about why I shouldn't just hit it with the bug spray. You might say, oh, it's a life like any other, or it's just living out its instincts, or it's a living creature just like you or I. But if you think you're accomplishing anything at all by humoring that type of thinking, you're just delusional. In reality, if there's a bug flying around in my office or my home and it catches my attention, I'm just going to kill it. Having a grounded and consistent ethical approach to life doesn't mean abandoning all common sense. Despite what a very vocal minority of deranged absolutists say, and say in bad faith, remember, you can care about animals without making these insane leaps of logic about how you need to swear off any and all animal-derived products forever. You can even have major issues with the meat industry itself. Personally, my biggest gripe with them would actually be with the underpayment and mistreatment of its workers, not the animals. I get that plenty of people do have legitimate concerns about eating meat and using animal products. But at the end of the day, a lot of what gets bandied around as a vegan lifestyle these days is just misdirected performativity for the sake of making a point. There's plenty of regular people around who are more conscientious about their plate of steak and eggs than many real vegans are about their bowl of corn syrup slop and a side of fries. I'm sure right now, somewhere there's a die-hard environmentalist very validly berating their vegan fellows for not swearing off consumer plastics or child labor-produced goods as well. And personally, if I were in their shoes, I'd also add that laying the accountability of the environment's generalized well-being on the actions of any average person rather than on the actions of large corporate interests which cause the world's despoilation is actually a sop to the uppercase C conservative myth of individual responsibility anyway. The most unfortunate part of it is, for those of us here on the cultural left, it would be very hard, in fact, quite likely impossible outright, to effectively push back with a material argument without straying into reactionary bootlicking corporatist territory. And while I'm not going to mediate my personal choices, I will also consciously avoid the overtly right-wing proposition on the matter too. Therefore, finally getting us back to my original point and the title of this video itself, perhaps the only viable response for someone in my particular position is obtuse point-making performance in response back. That's where this non-practicing veganism comes in, wherein I functionally don't change my actions in any way, but I'll adopt this little label in order to avoid the argument altogether. It gets my point across, and it's now a practical shorthand for my position. If I ever get asked in real life about my dietary habits in progressive circles, I feel completely capable of saying, yeah, I'm a vegan, without elaborating. And if anyone ever asks me while I'm consuming animal products, and I'm feeling so generous as to not just tell them it's none of their business what I eat, I can always just follow up by stating, oh yeah, I'm a vegan, but just not practicing, in the exact same tone that, say, a self-described Catholic who only attends services around the holidays might explain their religiosity. Congratulations, I completely recognize that you've reasoned your way into the only completely non-hypocritical argument on the matter, and demonstrated the massive philosophical fault at the heart of omnivorous consumption. I'll agree with you completely there, but I won't be changing my behavior. I'll still eat meat, and I'll still enjoy it. I'll still squash bugs if they so much as inconvenience me, but now I'll be doing so having acknowledged the correctness of your argument against me doing so. And since I agree, I'll even call myself a vegan, just a non-practicing vegan, and I see no reason why I shouldn't. And if you're anything like me, you should feel free to take this dietary approach to life too. And if you want, feel free to even further the line of non-practicing vegan thinking however you want. Maybe try defending it by attacking the very concept of gatekeeping and identity, or start splitting hairs about what ought to constitute veganism in practice anyway. You could say stuff like, well, does honey count? Is there an ethical difference between consuming factory farm and paddock-raised livestock? Surely a human could theoretically consent to their own consumption. Can voluntary cannibalism be vegan? If so, it's clearly not the meat alone that makes something non-vegan then, is it? This sort of questioning isn't really productive, and it isn't meant to be. It's akin to asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But if it's what the discourse surrounding personal dietary choices must come to, then so be it. I don't think that the derisive quotation marks here, real veganism, is a worthwhile behavioral line to take. And while I'm definitely never going to be in a position to convince the whole world of that, I might, however, have a workable interest in spreading my views on the matter to the rest of my social sphere. Not a bad idea, then, to essentially have a way of preemptively subverting the typical vegan line out of existence among those near me if the level of discourse we've arrived at is just merely a game of post hoc semantics from here on out. In this late capital reality, where aesthetic and moral preferences can only be expressed through consumer choices either way, then at the very least, my consumptive decisions will remain mine alone. That's everything for today. I hope that you got something worthwhile from all that. If you'd ever like to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe or go through the back catalogue of videos on this YouTube page. Once again, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. Until next time, bye for now, and have a lovely day.